Rain lashed against the broken windows of the abandoned cabin, each drop sounding like a warning. Emma's flashlight cut through the oppressive darkness, revealing the decay that time had left behind. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and the floorboards groaned under her tentative steps. She had been warned not to come here, but curiosity and a hint of disbelief had led her through the winding forest roads to this forgotten place. Her breath fogged in the cold air as she swept the light across the room, landing on overturned chairs and a table scattered with old, yellowed papers. Every shadow seemed to twitch, and every creak of the cabin made her heart hammer louder. The rain outside intensified, hammering against the walls with an almost threatening rhythm, as if the storm itself were conspiring with the dark presence she could sense lurking nearby. Emma's instincts screamed at her to leave, but she pressed on, moving deeper into the cabin. That's when she saw it, a figure standing in the doorway behind her. The silhouette was menacing, silent, and immovable. Her pulse quickened as the shape in the darkness became clearer, holding what appeared to be a long, dark object, an umbrella or perhaps something far more sinister. The air felt heavy, suffocating. Emma's mind raced, trying to convince her that she was imagining things, that the shadows were just tricks of her flashlight. But the cold dread settling in her stomach was very real. She whispered a trembling, "Who's there?" But no answer came, only the rhythmic patter of rain and the distant echo of her own breath. Memories of the local legends surfaced, the stories of people who entered the cabin and were never seen again, whispers of a shadowy figure who waited for intruders with a strange, merciless patience. Emma had always dismissed them as tales to scare children, yet now every word seemed to ring with truth. Suddenly the figure moved, not quickly, but with a terrifying certainty. Emma stumbled backward, the beam of her flashlight bouncing across the walls, catching glimpses of her own fear reflected in the grimy surfaces. Chairs toppled over as she backed away, and the sound of splintering wood mixed with the rain's relentless drum. Her heart thudded against her ribcage, each beat matching the relentless footsteps closing in behind her. Desperate, she turned, scanning for an escape. The window was old, the glass fragile, and outside the storm raged with unrelenting fury. But before she could reach it, the figure's shadow fell across her path. Emma's scream was swallowed by the storm as she realized that some fears aren't conjured by imagination. They are alive, patient, and waiting. In that cabin, drenched by rain and shrouded in darkness, Emma understood a horrifying truth. Curiosity had led her into a place where the past refused to stay buried, and now the shadow was ready to claim what it had been waiting for. Panic surged through her, sharp and cold, as Emma stumbled backward. Her flashlight flickered wildly, painting fleeting glimpses of splintered wood and grimy walls. Her own reflection seemed to leap from the shattered glass and warped surfaces, amplifying the terror clawing at her mind. Each step brought her closer to the wall, to the corner where the rain's relentless percussion mixed with the groaning of the cabin. Chairs toppled with sharp crashes, scattering papers and sending dust into the frigid air. The shadow behind her advanced with an eerie, inescapable certainty, the dark shape growing more defined with each agonizing step. Emma's mind raced for a plan. A window, fragile, old, yet perhaps her only salvation, gleamed in a distant corner. She lunged forward, hoping against hope, but the figure shifted, its shadow stretching impossibly across the room to block her path. Her heart pounded so loudly she thought the creature might hear it. She tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed instantly by the storm, leaving her alone with the cabin's malevolent presence. Memories of warnings and whispered tales surged through her mind. People had spoken of an entity that did not act in haste but waited, centuries perhaps, for the right moment to strike. Emma had dismissed these warnings, thinking herself rational, immune to superstition. Now faced with the silent inevitability of the figure before her, she realized just how wrong she had been. Fear was not just a sensation, it was a predator stalking her from every corner. She lunged for the window, pressing her trembling hands against the brittle glass. It rattled under her touch, and with a surge of desperate strength, she struck it, shattering the pane. Cold rain and wind lashed through the opening, soaking her to the bone, but freedom seemed within reach. Yet the shadow reacted instantly, gliding forward with impossible speed. Emma's eyes widened as she saw the shape lift its long, dark object. Not an umbrella, as she had hoped, but a grim, jagged tool that gleamed ominously in the fleeting light. Emma's scream tore through the storm, raw and unrestrained, as she realized that curiosity had led her to this fate. This cabin, abandoned by time and memory, had been waiting. The past, it seemed, refused to remain buried, and the shadow, patient, deliberate, and merciless, had finally found its quarry. Each heartbeat matched the figure's steps, the rhythm of inevitability pressing down on her chest. She stumbled backward, rain mixing with tears on her face, understanding at last that some terrors are alive, not conjured by imagination, but born from a dark will that waits for those foolish enough to trespass. In that cabin, surrounded by darkness, drenched in rain, and suffocated by fear, Emma faced the horrifying truth. Some doors once opened cannot be closed, and some shadows will follow you always. The rain was deafening now, pounding against the shattered windows and leaking through the roof, creating small, icy puddles on the warped wooden floor. Emma's soaked clothes clung to her trembling body, each movement sending shivers down her spine. The shadow had moved closer, its presence pressing down on her like a physical weight. Her mind raced. How could something so silent, so deliberate, instill such terror? Every instinct screamed for her to flee, yet her limbs felt heavy, unresponsive, as though the cabin itself conspired to hold her in its decrepit grasp. Emma forced herself to move, shoving past a toppled chair and scattering faded papers. Each step sounded like a thunderclap in the silent tension that had overtaken the cabin. She tried to make sense of what she was seeing. A figure that defied natural movement, gliding almost unnaturally, perfectly timed with her panic. The long, dark object in its hands, whatever it was, gleamed faintly in the dim light, a cruel promise of harm. She ducked behind a broken table, heart hammering against her ribs, listening to the rain and the soft, inevitable footsteps of her pursuer. Her flashlight flickered dangerously, threatening to go out. The darkness around her deepened, swallowing corners, stretching shadows into grotesque shapes that seemed alive. Emma's breath came in ragged gasps. The storm outside had become a mere backdrop to the suffocating terror within these walls. She tried to rationalize, to tell herself it was a trick of the light, a figment of her imagination, but deep down she knew the truth. The shadow was real, and it was coming for her. Panic clawed at her as she looked for another escape. The door she had entered through was too far, the windows too brittle, and the walls seemed to close in. She considered hiding, pressing herself against the corner, trying to blend into the darkness, but even that felt futile. The shadow didn't stumble, it didn't hesitate. It simply existed, an unstoppable presence that could sense her every move. Desperation surged, mingled with a raw, instinctive courage. Emma grabbed a long, broken plank from the floor and held it like a weapon, trembling but determined. The shadow paused, its head, or whatever served as its head, tilting slightly as if aware of her defiance. That brief hesitation gave her a spark of hope, but it was fleeting. She knew she couldn't confront it, not directly. Her only chance was to outsmart it, to use the cabin itself to her advantage. Emma ran, sliding across the slick floor, dodging furniture and debris, her wet hair plastered to her face. The shadow followed, silent yet persistent, every movement calculated, patient, unyielding. A thought struck her. If the legends were true, the cabin itself had claimed victims before. Perhaps she could use that to her advantage. Leading it through the narrow corridors, past the splintered furniture, maybe the very walls that had held people captive for decades could trap it, or at least slow it down. As she rounded a corner, she glimpsed a trapdoor partially hidden beneath rotting floorboards. Her pulse surged with adrenaline. With trembling hands, she yanked it open, the smell of damp earth rising from below. She hesitated only a moment before plunging into the darkness, the shadow poised at the edge, its presence a silent roar of menace. Emma fell into the unknown below, the sound of splintering wood and the relentless storm above mixing with her own terrified scream. In the suffocating darkness beneath the cabin, she realized that escape was only the beginning. The shadow was patient, relentless, and it would not let her go so easily. Emma landed hard on the cold, damp ground beneath the cabin, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. She lay for a moment, gasping, her flashlight rolling out of reach, leaving her in near-complete darkness. The air smelled of earth and decay, thick and suffocating, pressing against her chest like an invisible weight. Her ears rang with the echo of the storm above, but down here it was almost silent, a dangerous quiet that made the smallest sound feel amplified. The trapdoor above her rattled as the shadow hovered at the edge, its dark form unmoving, as if testing her resolve. Emma knew she couldn't stay here. The crawl space stretched into narrow passages lined with damp, rotting beams and piles of debris. Every step she took sent splinters and dust flying, each sound betraying her location. Yet moving was the only chance she had. Standing still meant the shadow would find her, and then there would be no escape. She groped along the rough walls, fingers scraping against cold wood and jagged edges. The darkness felt alive, almost sentient, and Emma's mind raced with every horror story she had ever heard. Whispers of the missing, echoes of footsteps that weren't hers, seemed to rise from the shadows themselves. She shivered violently, not just from cold, but from the unmistakable presence that was still above, patient, waiting, listening. Her thoughts spun. How many had fallen into this very trap? How many had believed they could outwit the darkness? Legends said the shadow didn't hunt blindly. It learned, it anticipated, it adapted. Each victim became part of its memory, a lesson in fear. Emma's pulse thumped in her ears as she realized she had become part of its endless practice, its cruel amusement. The crawl space narrowed, forcing her to move on hands and knees. Her wet clothes clung to her, the mud beneath her making every movement sluggish. Then she heard it, a soft, deliberate sound from above. A scraping noise like nails against wood, deliberate and measured. The shadow was moving down, descending into the trap she had used, refusing to be deterred. Her stomach twisted in dread. She had not escaped. She had only delayed the inevitable. Emma's hand brushed against something solid. A stack of crates, old and splintered. She climbed on top of them, hoping to gain a vantage point, to find another route out. The space opened slightly above her, revealing a narrow vent that might lead to the surface. Her heart leapt, freedom seemed almost within reach. But the moment she began to climb, the shadow's presence pressed down even harder, and the air grew icy, almost suffocating. She felt it, a silent threat that wrapped around her mind as much as her body. A shiver ran down her spine as she realized that the cabin itself was no longer just a building. It was a maze, a predator in league with the shadow. Every creak, every rotten beam, every narrow passageway was a trap designed to confuse, to terrify, and ultimately to consume. Her hands trembled on the vent's rusty edges. Escape was possible, but the shadow would not let her go willingly. Every nerve screamed at her to keep moving, to climb, to fight, and pray she reached the surface before it did. With one final, desperate surge, Emma began to climb into the vent, her body aching, her mind straining against terror. The shadow's presence lingered just above, silent, patient, watching, as if savoring the game it had begun. And in that suffocating darkness, she understood the cruel truth. Some predators do not need to chase. You run, and they already know the path. Emma's fingers scraped along the edges of the rusty vent as she pulled herself upward, every movement slow and agonizing. The confined space made her feel as though the walls were closing in, suffocating her with every breath. Dirt and rust flakes fell into her hair and eyes, stinging and blinding her for brief moments. She dared not pause. The shadow was still there, just above, its presence pressing down like an invisible weight, patient and relentless. The vent was narrow, forcing her body to twist and contort as she climbed. Every creak of the metal reverberated through the hollow space, threatening to alert whatever was waiting outside. She could almost hear the faintest shift of the shadow's shape, the careful calculation behind each step it took. Emma's heart hammered in her chest, but she forced herself to focus. One wrong move, one hesitation, and she would fall, or worse, the shadow would be upon her. Finally, a sliver of moonlight cut through a rusted grate above her. Freedom. Her pulse surged with hope and adrenaline as she stretched toward the opening. Her fingers brushed the cold metal, catching on the edges, and she pulled with everything she had. The vent groaned under her weight, but she kept climbing, muscles trembling from the effort and fear. Rain whispered faintly from above, mingling with the pounding of her heart, a delicate counterpoint to the horror that had followed her here. Then she froze. A sound unlike the storm or the creaking vent echoed from behind, a whisper almost human but impossible to place. It was the shadow. It had followed her, descending silently, its patience unbroken. She could feel it in the air around her, a living presence that bent the darkness to its will. Her hands slipped on the cold metal and panic surged. For a moment she imagined herself trapped, falling back into the endless abyss below. No, not yet. Not here. Summoning every ounce of strength, Emma twisted and kicked, leveraging herself upward until at last she emerged from the vent, breaking into the storm outside. Rain lashed her face and soaked her to the bone, but the open air, though chaotic, felt like salvation. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the forest in brief, stark flashes. For a fleeting second, she saw it. The shadow lingering at the cabin's broken doorway, its dark form unmoving, watching. And then, as if satisfied with the game, it retreated into the blackened doorway, melting into the darkness within. Emma sank to the forest floor, chest heaving, mud and rain mixing on her skin. Her body shook uncontrollably, but she forced herself to move. The storm roared around her, yet it now felt like a shield, masking her from the shadow that waited. Her mind reeled. Had she escaped it entirely, or was it merely watching, calculating her next step? Every instinct screamed that it was not finished, that the cabin and its dark inhabitant had marked her in a way she could not erase. The rain softened slightly, but the chill remained. Emma stood, soaked and trembling, glancing back at the cabin. Its broken windows seemed to stare back at her, accusing, patient. The shadow had not left, it had only paused. She realized the horrifying truth. She could run, she could hide, but some darkness does not vanish. It waits, it learns, and it remembers. With a deep, shuddering breath, she turned toward the winding forest path, each step a tentative defiance of the terror that still clung to her. She did not look back again. Not yet. But in the marrow of her bones, she knew the shadow had not forgotten her. And one day, it would be waiting. Emma's boots sank into the soggy forest floor, mud sucking at her heels as she ran, each step a desperate attempt to put distance between herself and the cabin. The rain had lessened to a drizzle, but the storm's echoes lingered, drumming through the trees and rattling her nerves. She felt exposed in the open, vulnerable under the skeletal canopy of leafless branches that scratched against her soaked hair and skin. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made her spin around, heart hammering, expecting the shadow to emerge from the darkness. The forest seemed endless, the winding paths looping in unnatural ways. Emma's sense of direction faltered as the dense trees pressed in around her, their trunks twisted and gnarled like the fingers of some ancient, watching entity. A cold wind whispered through the branches, carrying with it a strange, almost human sound. Laughter low and distant, then fading into silence. She stumbled to a halt, chest heaving, and swallowed hard. The sound couldn't be real, could it? Her mind raced with fragments of local legends she had once dismissed, stories of wanderers who ventured too far into the forest and were never seen again. Tales of the shadow that didn't merely haunt the cabin, but followed those foolish enough to escape its lair, using patience and cunning to stalk them until they were trapped once more. A shiver ran down her spine. Had she truly escaped, or had she merely entered another layer of the nightmare? She forced herself forward, trying to focus on the path ahead. Every step was calculated, each branch and root a potential obstacle, yet each sound made her flinch. Something moved in the corner of her eye, a flicker, a shadow among shadows, faster than the wind, yet indistinct. Emma's pulse quickened. She told herself it was nothing, a trick of her terror-addled mind, but deep down she knew better. She had seen what waited in the cabin. She knew what stalked. The forest floor opened into a small clearing, a pit of pale moonlight breaking through the canopy. Emma's wet clothes clung to her, weightless in the sense of exhaustion, but she refused to stop. She scanned the clearing, heart pounding, noticing the jagged silhouettes of old trees leaning like guardians or sentinels. The shadows they cast merged with the darkness of the woods beyond, creating shapes that seemed alive. And then, for a fleeting heartbeat, she saw it. A dark figure gliding silently between the trees, impossibly tall, its form indistinct yet unmistakably the same shadow from the cabin. Fear exploded through her veins. Her legs pumped faster, each stride desperate and uneven, splashing through puddles and tangled roots. The shadow did not chase, not in the way a normal predator would. It simply followed, patient, unwavering, a silent force moving with an unholy precision that made her heart ache with dread. Emma's mind screamed for logic, for a plan, but there was none. Only survival, only running. Branches lashed at her face, cutting skin, but she barely noticed. She could feel the shadow in the periphery pressing against the air, a weight that pulled at her, chilling her from the inside out. Every instinct, every sense, screamed that she was not safe, not yet. The forest, once a refuge, had become another part of the nightmare, each step leading her deeper into a dark, living labyrinth designed by patience and terror itself. Emma's breath came in ragged gasps, her mind whirling with the truth she now knew. The shadow did not sleep, it did not tire, and it remembered. And in the whispering forest, soaked by rain and haunted by darkness, Emma realized that the chase had only just begun. Emma's legs burned with exhaustion as she plunged deeper into the forest, branches slapping against her wet clothes and scratching her arms and face. Every sound, a distant owl, the wind through the trees, the squelch of her own boots in the mud, felt amplified, turning the forest into a labyrinth of invisible threats. She forced herself to focus, to ignore the growing weight of fear pressing against her chest. But deep down, she knew it was futile. The shadow was still out there. She could feel it, patient, moving with deliberate silence just beyond her vision. Her path twisted through dense underbrush, roots snaring her steps, forcing her to stumble and claw her way forward. The forest seemed to shift around her, the trees bending in unnatural ways, creating long, slanted shadows that mirrored her terror. She could hear the faintest sound behind her, a scraping, deliberate, almost casual, but enough to make her pulse spike. The shadow was close, closer than it had ever been, yet it did not rush. It did not need to. Patience was its weapon, and she could feel it savoring her fear. She paused for a moment, chest heaving, trying to listen. The forest was eerily quiet, save for the whisper of rain dripping from the leaves. Then a twig snapped sharply to her right, and her heart leapt into her throat. The shadow moved again, gliding silently between the trees, its shape impossible to define, yet undeniably there. Emma forced herself to keep running, adrenaline surging through her veins, but her mind screamed warnings she could not ignore. The stories were true. This creature did not hunt blindly. It watched, it learned, and it remembered. Ahead, a faint light flickered through the trees. A cabin. A house. Hope flared in her chest, brief and blinding, and she sprinted toward it, ignoring the ache in her muscles and the mud that slowed her steps. The forest seemed to respond, branches reaching to trip her, roots clawing at her ankles as if the very ground conspired to hold her back. She stumbled, nearly falling, and the shadow was there again, just beyond the tree line, watching, waiting, patient as ever. Emma scrambled to her feet and pushed forward, finally reaching the edge of a small clearing. The flickering light became clearer, an old lantern swinging on a porch. She dashed toward it, each step a desperate prayer for safety. The shadow did not follow immediately. It paused at the tree line, its dark form unmoving, almost contemplative. Her pulse slowed just slightly, but only for a moment. She knew the pause was temporary. It had not given up. It could not. The porch creaked under her wet shoes as she climbed the steps, the lantern casting a warm, golden glow. Inside the doorway, a faint warmth and the smell of burning wood greeted her, offering a fragile sense of safety. She glanced back, half expecting the shadow to surge forward, but it remained at the edge of the forest, motionless, watching. A chilling realization settled in her chest. Escape was never final. The shadow did not tire. It did not forget. Emma pressed herself against the doorway, shivering from cold, exhaustion, and fear. The forest behind her was silent again, yet she could feel the dark presence lingering, waiting for the next move. The storm had eased, but its threat lingered in her mind, mingling with the shadow that refused to release her. One truth was clear. Survival would demand cunning, courage, and vigilance. The shadow was patient, but Emma would need more than hope to survive the night. Emma sank to the floor of the old cabin, her body trembling from exhaustion, cold, and terror. The warm light from the lantern offered comfort, but it also illuminated the cabin's decrepit interior. A small, dusty room filled with old furniture, faded curtains, and a fireplace long cold except for the faint ember glow from the lantern. She pressed her back to the wall, trying to steady her racing heart. But even here, she felt the oppressive presence of the shadow, lurking just beyond the door, outside in the dark forest. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for anything at all, that might explain the horrors she had endured. That's when she noticed the walls. Faded symbols were etched into the wood, hidden beneath years of dust and grime, forming patterns that seemed almost alive in the flickering lantern light. Emma bent closer, tracing the intricate carvings with trembling fingers. Strange runes and jagged markings hinted at something ancient, something malevolent. It dawned on her that the cabin itself was a trap, a vessel for the dark force she had encountered.